So ready to go. We're being counted down. Thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to this session discussion about the Chinese economy with two at the moment, hopefully three distinguished experts. To my immediate right is Professor Michael Pettis from Peking University. To his right, Professor Yu Yongding. And Alicia Garcia-Herrero is behind me, taking part via Zoom from Taipei. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us, and thank you for listening. I'd like to start off by presenting a point of view. The first thing I think to remark is how paradoxical it is that an economy that is growing at 5% seems to be the subject of so much discussion about how bad things are and how low confidence is among households and corporates. It's a kind of mismatch that in any other country would be completely unknown. But we have this kind of paradoxical thing in China where you can have very high growth rate by anybody's standards, and yet people don't feel like the country is going anywhere. But let's focus in on how best to explain this kind of slump in confidence. And the point of view that I'd like to express to get your initial reactions is that what's really at the heart of what's going on in the Chinese economy these days is the project that the Chinese authorities have of reducing the economy's reliance on real estate investment. And this project is an unshakable commitment. And I would say that it has partly a pure economic element to it, in the sense that having 25 or 30% of GDP coming from one sector of the economy, real estate, is just putting too many eggs in one basket. So there's a pure economics argument for diversifying the economy. But I also suspect that one of the things that is going on in the minds of Chinese policymakers is a kind of strategic imperative, that you need to reduce the economy's dependence on real estate investment in order to allow capital and credit resources to migrate to new sectors of the economy that the authorities think are strategically more important, these new productive forces that everybody talks about. And these are industries like electric vehicles or lithium batteries or solar panels, that this sort of new technology industries that China now wants to prioritize. So my first question to you all is, first of all, whether you have any big disagreements with that framework, with that way of thinking about the decision-making of the Chinese authorities. And secondly, whether it makes any sense to think that these new areas of investment can fully compensate for the loss of real estate investment. In other words, is this project of weaning the economy off of its dependence on real estate necessarily going to lead to slower growth, because these new productive forces, these new areas of investment, just can't take up the slack that is left by the absence of real estate investment? Michael, please react.
Well, yes, the first thing I would say is that when we talk about China growing at 5%, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the GDP growth rates. And people suggest that the numbers are wrong, et cetera, et cetera. There may be some exaggerations in the numbers, but the real problem is not that China isn't, or China's GDP isn't growing at 5%. The real problem is what GDP means in the China context. And here it's really useful. I always recommend that my students read Janos Kornai, a Hungarian economist that died just a few years ago. He was very influential here in China. And what Kornai argued is that the GDP calculation doesn't really know how to distinguish between productive investment, productive activity, and non-productive activity. But, he said, in a capitalist economy, you have an adjustment mechanism, and it's what he called the hard budget constraint. If you engage in non-productive activity, you will go bankrupt. The activity added to GDP, as you go bankrupt, you subtract from GDP, and therefore GDP is more or less a useful measure of what we think it's supposed to measure, the real value of goods and services produced within the economy. But what Kornai argued, and he grew up in Hungary behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, and he argued in those economies, you didn't have the hard budget constraint. You could direct an increasing amount of activity into areas that don't experience bankruptcy, in which case you can have a significant buildup of activity that wouldn't occur in say, Brazil or Germany or Greece or the United States. So the important point that I want to make is that 5% GDP growth in China is not comparable to 5% GDP growth, say, in Greece or in India or in the US. It's a very different number.
Very interesting. Alicia, what do you make of the question of how central this project of reducing the economy's reliance on real estate investment is to explaining how soggy things feel in China these days?
Okay, so this project, as you describe it, and I quite agree with your description, started with the so-called 3 red lines in August 2020, and it actually exploded, if you want, with Evergrande default. I think, can you hear me? Or?
Yep, we can. Okay.
In mid-2021. It so happens that 2021 was a very special year because China grew over 8%. Yeah. So you saw this massive reduction in asset investment, which you're right, was big in 2019, about a third. So to your question, manufacturing FDI was 1/3, infrastructure 1/3, real estate 1/3. So in principle, you could have absorbed it. I mean, just by loading more infra, loading more manufacturing. The reason why it was not absorbed so easily is because 2022 was a disaster. And it was not only because of real estate. Let's not forget that China was basically locked for months, at least Shanghai and other cities. So it's hard to disentangle how much was the real estate as opposed to everything else. But what we know now is that the mantra is to keep fixed asset investment in manufacturing going. This is, as you said, the 3 new sectors, or now, can they substitute the real estate? Well, that's to me not even the question, because at some point the real estate will be smaller. This sector, it's already happening. It's growing at -10. This fixed asset investment. The supply will shrink. The question really is how productive, going back to Michael, this fixed asset investment in manufacturing will end up being, because you may go from bad, I wouldn't say to worse, but to still slightly bad, because we will end up with overcapacity. You need people to buy what they're producing, yeah? And we know that this has not been the case. Overcapacity probably on average, today, on average, is as bad as in 2015. Maybe not, there are probably not sectors with 50% utilization ratio, that was really bad, but overall there are more sectors with overcapacity. So to me the question is, can China do something else, maybe consume more? What about services? What about, rather than just from one sector to, again, same kind of, nailing another sector, which you need the world for, because China is not consuming enough to absorb all of this. So for me, really, this is the question. Not so much the real estate anymore, but the solution to that problem, perhaps being too aggressive on a single goal.
Yongding, I guess, when I focus on the role of reducing real estate investment, I guess what I haven't said is that there are other explanations. You might focus on demographics as a way of explaining this sort of slowdown. You might focus on the hostility of trade policy among various of China's trade partners to explain, what's going on. So in the context of all of these alternative explanations for why things in China feel so weak, where do you rank the real estate project?
I think basically you raise three questions. Number one, why when China is able to maintain the growth rate something like 4 to 5%, but in China people are not very satisfied with this kind of situation. Even there are some people are very disappointed with this growth rate, even though it's much higher than most of the other countries. I think to this question, I think it's basically because over the past 40 years, China's growth rate is too high, something like 10%. And in 2012, the first quarter, the growth rate is 12.2%, 12.2%. Then starting from then on, China's growth rate has been slowing down almost on the yearly and quarterly basis. So by the end of 2019, the growth rate is something like 6%. Over the past 3 years, it's something like 4.65%. 4.65%, very low, I mean, during the COVID period. So this is a very sharp contrast. Yeah. We used to kind of very high growth rate. Then suddenly we found that growth rate is falling. And we haven't seen the end of this. Where is the end of the tunnel? Whether it will continue to grow or it will stabilize. So this is why people are worried. Then why we are facing this situation? There are lots of different explanations. Some people said this is because of aging, because of diminishing return to scale, because of lack of reform, and so on and so forth. This is the one commonly accepted explanation. Whenever I give a presentation, I will call this kind of a thing. Then I will ask audience whether you agree with my quotation. I read something. Everybody say, yes, you are right, because these kind of fundamental factors, so China's slowdown is inevitable. I said, that's wrong. Because what I quoted is actually was written by myself in 1998. We can see these kind of long-term factors. It will work on Chinese economy, so it's inevitable. But you cannot predict when it will reach to what level. So actually, there's plenty of room for policy to play its role. So my personal view is that since 2012, China's macroeconomic policy is rather cautious or conservative. Michael may not agree, okay? But I want to emphasize, since March of 2012, China's PPI has entered into negative territory for 54 months in a row. Then again in 2019, 2022, in negative territory. So for the best part of the last decade, PPI is in negative territory. And China's CPI lower than 3% since May of 2012. And then it becomes something like less 2%. Then recently, 0%. Even some months it's negative. So it's very clear. While growth rate has been declining, and inflation rate is very low, so policy response should be very clear. Yeah. We should use the expansionary fiscal policy and monetary policy to prompt the economy, just like the United States. So forth.
I definitely want to come back to the questions about monetary and fiscal policy and whether they're doing as much as they could or should be doing to support the economy. But I want to come back to the original mission of trying to explain why confidence seems so low. And one other explanation that we've not got to yet is the idea that ideology may be having a growing effect on the performance of the economy. And I'm talking particularly about a couple of things. The first is this campaign that started to become evident in 2020, 2021 about the unrestrained expansion of capital. The idea that the authorities in Beijing had decided that the private sector was just too out of control and that they needed to be disciplined, they needed to be reined in. And that reached its peak, as I remember, in December 2021 at the Central Economic Works Conference, where there was a proposal to create a traffic light system where the authorities would decide what kind of private sector investment was good, what kind of private sector investment was not good. And that's kind of an ideological insertion into the formation of economic policy, which in a way has its counterpart in what I think many people understand as being Xi's preference for the state-owned sector. Back in the 19th Party Congress, I guess in 2017, bigger, better, stronger SOEs was an important theme. And Michael, I wonder, does that ring true to you at all? Do you think that ideology is playing a growing role in the shaping of economic policy in China?
That's been almost the heart of the recent debate, certainly outside of China, about what went wrong. So there are basically two schools of thought. One group argues that things were going very well, and then, to simplify it, one day Xi Jinping woke up and became a communist. And ever since then, things have been going terribly. I'm very skeptical about that argument, because I always remind people that when Xi first became secretary of the party, most of the response was very positive, because Xi was famously a market man and very pragmatic. And now we argue that he's the complete opposite. The other argument, the other group of people, of which I include myself, and I believe Alicia is probably a member of that group, we believe that it's much more structural, that the shift away from the private sector to the public sector has structural roots. And in 2012, when we didn't even know who was going to be the new Secretary General, and I knew almost nothing about Xi Jinping, I wrote an essay in which I argued that whoever was the next president, whoever was the next Secretary General, was going to shift away from the private sector towards the public sector, because as an increasing amount of economic activity was non-productive economic activity, because they set very high GDP growth targets, we would see, as we've seen in Japan in the 80s, as we saw in the Soviet Union in the 60s, as we saw in Brazil in the 1970s, because of these very high growth targets set under an investment model, you had to shift more and more of the activity away from the private sector towards the public sector. So I would argue that this was inevitable. If it hadn't been Xi, it would have been somebody else.
Very interesting. Alicia, is Michael accurately portraying your view?
Yes, he is, but I want to add something. I think Michael is totally right that it would have been so difficult to solve China's imbalances, no matter who would have been basically leading the party and leading the government. But I would argue that the solution, i.e. this consumption-driven growth that we all think China should be pursuing, in a way is somehow difficult to carry out with China's political model. And maybe you don't think will disagree, but I feel like its own control is much easier to control, I would say even private companies, to be frank, than households. The more you create, just imagine a welfare state with automatic stabilizers, like European style, which clearly is not very favored by leadership, the welfareism. You don't need to do anything. You just have to let things go, whether it's unemployment benefits, pension, you name it. So you lose control. So for me, there is, beyond what Michael said, also not a change in ideology. I wouldn't say that. An ideology, not a change in ideology. So it's just something that makes the correction of those imbalances harder than they would be otherwise.
I definitely want to come back to this question about the relationship between consumption and investment within GDP. But Yongding, on that question of the role that ideology plays. Do you think that there's anything to that? Or?
Actually, as a macroeconomist, I have never paid much attention to these kind of problems. Actually, when I'm talking about China's macroeconomics, my starting point is 2010. I think the new government took over in 2012, right? Later 2012. So in my mind, I don't have this kind of demarcation in which year who take over and so on.
Yeah.
So I don't think the policy has been changed. This is continuation. My disagreement with the government is that I think the government withdrew from this stimulus package too early, too soon. Of course, this 4 trillion created lots of problems. I think during that period of time, we both wrote something. We are on the same page. Yep. And I wrote an article in FT saying we need more reform, less investment, so on and so forth. But after so many years, I see this continuation in declining of the growth rate. I feel very strongly China should learn something from the United States. They introduced QE, they introduced zero interest policy. Of course, China should not go that far. But I think China withdrew too quickly. In 2009, China's budget deficit to GDP ratio is 2.8%. But in 2011, it became 1.1%. When the United States continued to expand rapidly. And in 2009, China's increase in credit is 9.6%. 9.6 trillion. But in 2000, it becomes 7 trillion. This have changed your policy. Inevitably, will shock the economy, cause lots of problems. So this kind of continuation. I think the policy, the decision makers are too cautious. China's growth potential is still big, as I just tried to show that, because China is suffering from deflation, not inflation, which means that we have a higher growth potential. Why shouldn't we explore that? Of course, during this period of time, we should pay great attention to structural issues. To contain that rampant capitalist activities. Yes, we had to admit that there's something wrong with that. And also pay great attention to income distribution. I said, I have to admit, we should do lots about this sort of thing a long time ago, but we didn't do that. So this is the problems. Yeah. But at this stage, this is a long-term, mid-term issue. Question, yes, we can say we should reform China's tax system. For example, property tax. But now this real estate development is falling. Impossible. So you increase this tax, you make the situation worse. Yeah. So this is extremely complicated.
Part of what you said brings us very neatly on to the second question that I wanted to address, which is, given the fact that the mood in China, corporate sector confidence, household sector confidence, both seem so low, it is astonishing that the degree of fiscal support and the degree of monetary support for the economy have been so minuscule. And I want to ask you three about how you all explain this kind of stinginess of fiscal policy and the stinginess of monetary policy. And let's talk about fiscal policy first. And I can think of a couple of possible explanations. One is that, by the IMF's definition, the public debt stock is already at 115% of GDP. And so against that background, the authorities might be saying, we just can't afford further fiscal loosening because the debt stock is already at the same level as the United States, but our per capita GDP is significantly lower, and so we're going to kill ourselves through over-indebtedness, so we have to be conservative about fiscal policy. Another possible explanation is more a kind of behavioral thing that Xi Jinping has published articles where he talks about his antipathy towards welfarism, because he thinks that welfarism generates lazy people. And so there's this, I wonder if there's anything to the idea that one of the reasons why fiscal policy is so stingy in China is that the authorities are trying to carve a certain type of Chinese citizen. And that kind of Chinese citizen that they want to aspire to is not one that depends on welfare. Michael, what do you think?
There probably is some of that. Certainly Xi Jinping's comments about welfarism have been pretty striking. Not so long ago, he made that comment about Latin America, in which you'll remember he said, if we give money to the people, they'll become lazy like the Latin Americans, which is probably not a very diplomatic thing to say. But you know, I would argue that there are also real institutional problems with delivering to the household sector. Yongding and I were talking before this meeting, and we both agreed that the big problem in China, or at least one of the big problems, is that the household sector simply doesn't have enough income to generate the demand needed to drive the rest of the economy. And so what we really need is a transfer of income to the household sector. And I think most economists, certainly most prominent economists in China, agree to that. So the real question that I have is not so much do they realize this is what they have to do, but rather why aren't they doing it? Why is it so difficult? And we could spend hours talking about that, but I always remind people that, you know, Japan had many of the problems China did. Japan in the 1980s, an excessive reliance on investment and trade surplus to drive growth, very weak domestic demand. And in 1986, the Japanese presented a proposal, it was called the Maekawa Commission Report, that sort of outlined everything Japan needed to do to boost the consumption side of GDP, to boost the household income side of GDP. And here we are 38 years later, and we're still talking about the need to boost the consumption side and the household income side of GDP in Japan. So I would argue that it's much harder said than done. You need major transformations, institutional transformations of political, business, and financial institutions. And I think that's really what China has to focus on. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a big discussion there yet. It is widely agreed that we need to shift income to the household sector, but there isn't much discussion on why that's proven so difficult.
Alicia, why not? Why is it proven so difficult?
Well, let's take Japan, and I think that might be the answer for China, is that you need to do it when your labor productivity is growing. You need to do it at the right time. You need to do it when indeed labor, gets the productivity that you need for wages to grow. I have to say, China did try. I mean, wages increased massively after the global financial crisis, coming down up to 2019. But basically, as they were coming down, labor productivity was also coming down. So the issue is, did it come too late? This is what happened in Japan. So not that you always have the time to support wages through consumption through wage growth. You can only do that when you're productive, when your labor productivity is still increasing fast because you are in a catching up mode. But let's face it, China is no longer, since 2022, catching up with the US. Maybe catching up with Europe, maybe catching up with Japan. But the point is, if you really want to create that consumption out of your GDP, you need to do it when your labor productivity is growing, at the beginning of the convergence. Then China wouldn't have had enough savings to do what China did with this investment. They have become a major industrial power. I mean, there's trade-offs here. China used its savings to invest and hoping that it would work at the right time to consume what they had produced. But maybe that was too late. That would be my take.
Yongding, I know that you believe that fiscal policy should be looser.
Yes.
Why isn't it?
I think for many years, Chinese government was very fearful about the accumulation of debt. So we emphasize the importance of lowering the leverage ratio and so on. And as a matter of fact, China's overall leverage ratio is among highest in the world. But I think we should notice that there are two things we have to emphasize. Number one, why China's overall leverage ratio is very high? Because China's stock exchange is really performing very poorly. And so in terms of marketization of exchange market is something like 65% of GDP in 2012, 65%. In the United States, more than 200%. And then Chinese enterprise has to rely on borrowing from enterprises. So the loan to GDP ratio is more than 120% or something like that. So add things together, so China's overall leverage ratio is very high. But if you take this kind of situation into consideration, I mean, the poorly developed stock exchanges, then I think the leverage ratio for enterprise will fall. And on the whole, the dependence on external finance by enterprises in China is a little bit less than in the United States. They need to borrow. This is one thing. I mean, China needs to further improve its stock exchanges to reduce this so-called overbanking. Secondly, we should emphasize a very important factor. China is a high-saving country. China's saving is higher than investment in terms of the share of GDP. And so because you have a high saving, so you must have a high indebtedness. Otherwise, I cannot have a high saving. The good thing is that China is not relying on external finance. China is a net credit to the rest of the world. China is more than $2 trillion US dollar net credit. I mean, international investment position net, 2 trillion. Huge. So China should not worry too much about this indebtedness, because I borrow from my wife. My wife borrowed from his father. So in the same family. So I don't think that's really a problem. It really is not that important. This is my view. Of course, we should try to reduce this leverage ratio, but we should not worry too much about this. And so Chinese government should realize that. Important thing is two. One is growth rate, another is low interest rate. As long as you can fix this budget debt to GDP ratio at a relatively low level, as long as you maintain a decent growth rate, then this trajectory of government bond to GDP ratio will converge to an acceptable level. So I think this is sort of, I mean, we have sort of a misperception about the importance of a leverage ratio. So we try our best to reduce this leverage ratio. But at the same time, we forgot, if we reduce it too much, we will reduce growth rate, then it will make things worse.
Earlier, I was asking about, what you all thought about the role of ideology in shaping economic policy. And I want to kind of move on to another related question, which is about whether geopolitics or the geopolitical constraints that China finds itself facing may help to explain why, as you say, you're all arguing that China has plenty of fiscal space, but it's not using it. And I wonder whether geopolitics may be one of the reasons why China wants to adopt this kind of fortress-like approach to economic policy. Used the word mercantilism. Arguably, it's not necessarily that China wants a current account surplus for the sake of running a current account surplus, for the sake of building foreign exchange reserves. But it might want to preserve that surplus as a way of kind of creating a sort of a wall of insulation around the economy, so that, if geopolitical tensions get higher, China at least has a kind of protective wall to protect the economy. Does that make sense to you at all, Michael?
I don't see surpluses as a sign of economic efficiency or economic strength. I see surpluses as a sign of very weak domestic demand. And so what I would argue that the problem in China is precisely very weak domestic demand. There are two sources of domestic demand. There's investment and consumption. And for many years, China had been hugely underinvested in the 1970s and 1980s. And so they put into place a model, which is not particularly Chinese. Many countries have followed this model, in which they forced up domestic savings, that is, forcing down consumption, and channeling the savings into investment. And this was a great model when China was significantly underinvested. But what happened to China, and indeed happened to every single country that followed this model, is that they reached a point where they invested about as much as they could productively absorb. And when that happens, you need to shift to a different growth model. No one ever does. It's quite difficult to do. And you get that explosive growth in debt. As China has tried to bring investment down, you know, this is just classic balance of payments. If you have savings up here and investment up here, and you try to bring investment down and you can't bring savings down, by definition, you run a very large current account surplus, or in China's case, a trade surplus. We don't trust the current account surplus data. But what that tells us is that China runs trade surpluses because it simply cannot afford to absorb domestically everything that it produces. So I would argue that puts it in a weaker geopolitical position, because as you get rising protectionism in the US and in Europe, that puts enormous pressure on China to close the gap. And how do you close the gap? You can close it with a surge in unemployment, a surge in investment, which they don't want, or over the long term, an increase in the household share of GDP. But that's a very slow process. So I think, I don't think it strengthens the fortress. I think it weakens it.
Alicia, I mean, it seems to me that, you know, you can, on the one hand, see a sort of some shift in China towards import substitution, you know, developing your own semiconductor industry, focusing on green energy, which substitutes the imports of fossil fuels, placing priority on increasing investment in domestic agriculture, substitutes the import of agricultural products. So on the one hand, you've got import substitution. On the other hand, you've got a strong commitment to boosting exports. And we've seen at the moment, you know, the growth rate of Chinese export volumes is astonishing against the background of very weak global import growth. And it just feels to me that the whole direction of Chinese economic policy is almost guaranteed to keep the goods surplus, the trade and goods surplus, at extremely high levels. Is that a reasonable thought?
Yes, I think that, I mean, whether this is a consequence of China's imbalances, this is Michael's point, or whether China likes these surpluses, I would say both. It's not only that, wow, how imbalanced I am, and you know, it's just too difficult to solve this problem. I think it's both. Actually, I would argue that, you know, this mercantilism. I mean, it's just a feeling. And by the way, it's not only China. I mean, here in Taiwan, they have what, 11 or 12% trade surplus, and they love it. I mean, so and South Korea for the first time had a trade deficit with China, and they're screaming as if a bilateral deficit with China were a big thing. So you know, this is frankly not only China. Let's face it. But I want to go back, if you allow me for a second,
please,
to your question as to has China have all of that space to conduct fiscal policy? I agree, though, that China needs to solve its inflationary pressures, maybe monetary policy, I would argue. But when it comes to fiscal policy, I mean, just let's look at the numbers. 100% of GDP in debt, $13,000 per capita. There's no country in the world, not even India. India is lower public debt. And China is, India too, by the way, it's mostly sovereign debt. In India, it's also domestic, China even more. But the point is, your denominator is growing less than you think, because nominal GDP in China is growing less than the US.
Deflation, yeah.
So the sustainability of these debt dynamics, I know that all of this is internal, but who is holding this debt? I'm sure they won't like to see this debt being rebased, to put it nicely. So, you know, it has distributional consequences, basically. And for this debt to be eventually sustainable, you will need very low interest rates. What about Chinese banks? Well, I mean, how do you make this debt eventually sustainable, even being domestic? So I would argue that it's not so easy to just stimulate the economy through fiscal policy. And that's something that I think the government is aware of.
Yongding, as Alicia is saying, mercantilism is not only has a kind of strong history within China, but has a strong history within the region.
I agree.
And I wonder whether, you know, the bar to thinking that one day Chinese policymakers might overcome their obsession with mercantilism, that bar is just too high. It's just a kind of fixed feature of Chinese policymaking.
I think to a very large extent they have changed these views. I think at least since 2006. I think around 2006, China's current account surplus over GDP ratio is more than 10% or 9%, right, Michael? Extremely high. And so actually we debate this very heavily, and we argue for a long time China should not aim at accumulation of foreign exchange reserve. That is not good for China. It's a weakness. And we have enough foreign exchange reserves. So since then we argue, I think at least from 2003, I argue China should allow RMB to appreciate. Why I'm arguing that? Because appreciation will reduce China's export to make China's trade surplus smaller. I think gradually Chinese government has accepted this, and so they try to withdraw lots of policies which promote export. I think in the 80s we have a slogan called creating a foreign exchange creation economy. At the time, maybe it's all right because China's foreign exchange reserve is too few. But later on, we have accumulated more than enough. So I think they changed the policy. At this stage, I think the most important reason for the continuation of accumulation foreign exchange reserves running current account surplus is because lack of domestic demand. If China goes higher, and then we will import more. But if the growth rate is low, you have enough supply, then you have to find a way abroad. I think we have to change this the situation. The way of changing this position is to stimulate domestic demand. So I think this is background of the proposing of this dual circulation. The aim is not to establish a fortune. I think the aim is to reduce on the reliance of export. I think this aim is correct. The thing is that if you fail to stimulate the economy, it's difficult for China to reduce the trade surplus.
And without in the absence of further fiscal stimulus, do you think that China, it's correct to describe China as now being trapped in this kind of deflationary spiral where you have weak demand that encourages households to postpone their expenditure, that postponement of expenditure creates a more deflationary environment, and a more deflationary environment makes households even more willing to postpone spending. Is that the way you see it?
This is my fear. I raised the issue in 2015. Hopefully we can break this vicious circle.
Yeah. I kind of feel we've just got going, but we now have to wrap up. But thank you all very much indeed. It was a very, very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually.